record. Not a fan of it, but I'll do it. Okay. All right, I think that's going well enough. Okay, so I wanted to have a chat this afternoon about grammar, and in particular focus on the teaching of grammar in context, and an additional focus of teaching grammar at word level. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit today, equally talking about some of the grammar content and the pedagogy. So we'll just sort of go between those two things. If you have a question, please feel free to jump in at any stage, and anytime we have left over at the end, we can talk about particular ideas or conversations you want to have. To start the conversation off, this is one of 3 sessions that I'll do. So each Monday afternoon, this week word level, next week sentence level, and the 3rd week text level. Now each of those will have a similar framework that we'll talk about. We'll start talking about it today, but it will give you examples of the different sort of layers of teaching grammar. So feel free to come along to any or all of those that suit what you're teaching at the moment. We're often asked why we do these things, and for me, I teach at the University of Stirling. That's my day job. I've been working with pre-service teachers for about 14 years now, and prior to that I was a teacher myself in a primary school. But increasingly, or maybe not decreasingly, I'm seeing my students, my undergraduate students, come with huge levels of anxiety about the teaching of grammar. They not only are worried about teaching it, but they're worried about their own content knowledge. They don't feel that they have the content knowledge to teach it. And so their default view when I ask them about teaching grammar, or they plan for teaching grammar when they're on placement, is that they think that worksheets and textbooks are a safe way to be. The other thing that has prompted me to start this conversation is that I've been doing some research about Scottish primary and secondary teachers and their feelings about teaching grammar, and have found very similar kinds of conversations, that there's an anxiety about what to do, how to teach it, and that many schools are relying on a textbook or some kind of program to give that kind of safety net for teachers. And thirdly, the way, if we're talked into or we feel unsafe and then rely on a textbook, what we know is that the way that that textbook is set up, the discourses that are presented in the textbook affect the way that the teacher teaches. You're led by that textbook in certain ways, and then that of course has an influence on the way that our pupils learn. So does anybody want to jump in there? Would you say that your observations of either my pre-service teachers coming out to you or yourself, that there's a level of anxiety about what to do with grammar in the classroom? No? Quiet this afternoon? That's okay. All right. So anyway, that's what I've been seeing. What we know from the research is that grammar taught through textbooks or worksheets is not going to get you where you want. Students who are taught through textbooks or worksheets will be able to achieve identifying a particular grammatical concept in a standardized test. You know, if you give them a list and say, sort these into nouns and adjectives, they'll be able to do that. But what we do know is that it does not improve their writing at all. It's got a negative effect on their actual writing. And I mean, what's the purpose of teaching them grammar if not for them to become writers themselves? The other thing we have to remember is that grammar can be used for reading. That you know, this week in the news, when we see people arguing about whether to call it a demonstration or a riot, these are grammatical concepts that are heavily linked to critical literacy. So even when you think you're teaching grammar, you're teaching comprehension, you're teaching vocabulary, you're teaching critical literacy. It's a very powerful point to be making in your classroom. So what we have to do is think about, how are we presenting this idea of grammar in our classrooms? So I want you to think about the discourses. What happens in your classrooms now when you teach grammar? Have you felt yourself relying on a particular program or a particular textbook? Have you got a level of anxiety yourself about the content? Is there, you know, an anxiety about even doing the teaching because you're not sure whether you know what that content is? So how does what you do compare to what I'm going to talk you through? That's what I'd like you to come back and think about at the end. So what does it mean to be taught in context? And why have we gotten to here in the history of teaching grammar? Because there is history. Now, any of you who you know, are kind of, I guess, my age, I'm almost 50. When I went through school, 70s and 80s, I don't ever remember my teacher telling me anything about grammatical terminology. I don't remember being taught this is a noun, this is a verb. And that's because I was caught up in the lovely period of the 60s to the 90s in Australia, but it happened over here as well, where we had a kickback from what had happened prior to that. Prior to that was very much about exercises, a particular textbook that lots of schools or even states or countries had. And it was 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and you highlight this and you underline this, and very much tied to a set of exercises. And what happened in the 60s and 70s was they realized that this was not helping at all. But instead of doing what we should have done, which was to look for what might have worked, we went into this crazy, well, let's just take it out of the curriculum, let's take it out of the classroom, because you know what, kids are smart and they'll just learn it by osmosis, right? And that is why there's an entire generation of us who did not have the direct instruction, the learning that we needed to in grammar. I was lucky that it just appealed to me. It was interesting to me. And as a primary school teacher, I saw that when I did include it in my teaching, I saw results. But this is where we are now, that we've got another pushback coming that says, okay, no, the exercises don't work, but neither does this dreamy experience of let's just read literature and hope that something happens. The other big change is that we've gone from looking at traditional grammar. This is probably what you were taught at school, which was this is a noun, this is a verb, circle the noun, underline the verb. Very descriptive type of learning, to functional grammar, which is instead of looking at it at a tiny, tiny word level, we now look at it at least a clause, sentence and text level and say, what is that word or what is that grammatical concept doing within the text? Okay, so here's the difference. Instead of looking at the word round, R-O-U-N-D, if I was looking at traditional grammar, I might say, okay, that is an adjective. It's describing the shape of something. But a functional grammar look would say, well, where is it within a clause or a sentence? When the sentence is, I will shout the next round. And then it's not an adjective, it's a noun, a round, something that I'm going to shout for my friends in their drinks. So it became much more about how the text, the grammatical concept is being used within the text. So any of these ideas, afterwards, if you're interested, you could do some Google searching and have a look at some more information. Most of the talking that I'm going to be doing today, that what we need is a little bit of both to create the meta language. So we need kids to know verb is, what an adjective is. But we also need to make sure that they can use it functionally within their writing, that they can see what it's being used for in their reading. The history of the teaching of grammar is quite interesting. Where we are now is that we've got a new fascination with grammar. Well, I have. You may disagree, but it does tend to be swinging back again. In particular, the idea of functional grammar as a way of teaching children to write, so improving their writing. And the only thing that hasn't caught up yet, surprise, surprise, is the curriculum. So many of you will know when you go to the Scottish curriculum, the English, literacy and English E's and O's, and even the benchmarks, it has these lovely broad scoping statements like, I can speak about the grammar of a text. And of course that doesn't help us terribly much as teachers unless we understand and have the meta language ourselves. So I'm going to tell you about how you can work out what you're supposed to be teaching today and as we go through the next few weeks. Right, so word level grammar. In this case, I'm talking about mostly the 9 parts of speech. So I'm wondering, how good are you at remembering the 9 parts of speech? Do you think you would be able to do it? I'm sure sometimes I forget, but here they are. Some people will list them as 8 because they put the nouns and pronouns together. I prefer to have it as the 9 because I think pronouns stand enough for themselves. Each of these, doesn't matter what they are, we can use the same framework, the same sequence that I'm going to tell you about, to teach any of these things. But we have to make it meaningful. And that starts with the text and the text type or the genre, if that's the term you use, that you're wanting to teach your pupils. So today, perhaps, you might be focusing on the teaching of narratives. Narratives have inside them, they have lots of links towards verbs, the use of verbs, and the use of nouns. So I'm going to use those 2 as examples today. Right. So here's what you do instead of a textbook. A 4-step framework. If I haven't got the authors on there, I will make sure that I put that into Twitter. That involves reading and investigation, explicit teaching, discussion and experimentation, and then using that grammatical concept in some controlled writing situations. I'm going to give you an example of each of these using verbs as an idea. So what I would need to think about is wanting to teach narratives to my students, let's say primary 2 or primary 3 or whoever. And I'm going to start by thinking about what they need to know. And verbs, of course, is an important one. This is because in functional grammar, we learn that the teachers who taught us that verbs are doing words were only 1/4 correct. And in fact, there are 4 types of verbs. You could even argue 5, but we'll stick with 4. And those 4 different types of verbs used in a narrative affect the way your reader can see what's happening. So we talk about action verbs. These are the ones that your teacher was correct about, the doing words, things like jumped, swimming, swam, kicked, hopped, those sorts of words. But we also have verbs, we can categorize the words that we thought were verbs into saying verbs. So these are anything related to, of course, speech, singing, whispered, called, cried, screamed. We can also sort a category of thinking and feeling verbs. These ones are related to our senses, like hoped, wondered, felt, considered, believed. And then relating verbs, which are the verbs of being or having. And these are the trickiest ones to kind of contemplate when you're a young child, because they're not so easy to see. These are the ones like is, has, was, have, can. Okay, so what will we do with young children doing this? I mean, we're talking about nouns and verbs in very young age groups in schools. And of course, it doesn't really matter when you're doing it, as long as it's related to the type of text that you want them to teach. If you want them to create narratives, you want them to use interesting verbs, then you're going to be teaching them. So we could start out by using a text. And children's literature, whether you are looking at an older child or a young child, is the perfect place to start with grammar. They always have really lovely, clear examples. So even when I was teaching upper primary, I would use picture books as an entry point into the conversation about grammar. I would start with something like this. This is the book Cat and Fish. I don't know if you know this one. Author, let me go back, Joan Grant and Neil Curtis. The illustrations are absolutely beautiful. It's all done in black and white, but it has a very simple story, but it's absolutely full of verbs. So something that you might do in this reading and investigation stage is either read the story to the children or have them read it if they're of an upper school level, and have them collect all of the verbs that they can see, all of the words that show something happening. We would assume that they might understand what a verb is at a simple sort of level. And you might collect them on cards here, little sentence cards, so that you can use that as a follow-up later on. An open word sort, which is where you allow them to sort it in any way, is always a really nice way to start to see what they know. So once they have their whole group of verbs, and you've sorted through and made sure, yes, that what they have identified are actually verbs, you could say to them, I just want you to sort them in any meaningful way you think. Now, some of the students are going to look at these and work out that some of them might be about saying, and some of them might be about thinking. But it doesn't really matter how they sort them, as long as they're starting to have that conversation. Your end goal is for them to be able to see that there are 4 different types that can be used. Have a think about how this might affect a story. Narratives. We're going to see a lot of action, thinking and feeling, saying, or relating. Probably a lot of the first 3. Later on, you're going to have your pupils coming up to you with their stories, with their narratives. And you'll be able to say, because you've built this meta language, you'll be able to say, I'm looking at your story. I see lots and lots of action verbs. I see a few saying verbs. But you know what I don't see? I don't see any thinking or feeling verbs. I can't see into the character that you've created. Why don't you go and think about adding something in the thinking and feeling situation? And all of a sudden you get inside the brain or inside the thoughts of the author wanting us to see these, the characters. So after reading and investigation, we take it to the more traditional step, which is the explicit teaching. And here's where you can say things like, I saw the sorting that you were doing in your groups, and some of you put this one, this one, this one together. Why did you do that? Okay, that's because these are verbs of action. We can see things happening. And so in this situation, you might use some activities where you get them to identify what type of verb it is, where the verb is in the sentence. But this is a still built upon the text that you had. So going back, relating back to cat and fish, and what did they do? They prowled or they floated, and giving lots of examples from the text. Okay. You might even write your own text. And in the grammar teaching that I've seen work beautifully, teachers become writers themselves, sharing their own writing and sometimes deliberately doing it so that it needs work. You know, writing a whole paragraph that only contains the action verbs, and having the students realise that we really can't connect to that story unless we get a sense of what the characters are thinking or what they're saying. So the next step after explicit teaching is discussion and experimentation. And this is where I would take it as one example. I would get them back to using their verb cards. And this time the explicit discussion of what is lurked? What kind of a verb is the word lurked? Is it an action verb? Small groups or pairs discussing and experimenting with those ideas. And then you can get them to do all sorts of things like talking about which verbs do we see most in cat and fish and why might that be, and then sorting them. You can bring a new text into the situation here as well, because now you've done some groundwork, they've done some reading and investigation, you've explicitly talked to them about the 4 different types of verbs, and now let them go at some other sorts of texts that can be used. And just as a side note here, some texts can be beautiful critical literacy examples. The text called Piggy Book by Anthony, that's terrible, it's gone blank. Anyway, I'll write that one on Twitter as well. Has the most beautiful separation between males and females. You know, if you look at the verbs inside Piggy Book, the males get the saying verbs and the woman gets only action verbs. This is deliberate. You know, Anthony Brown. It's a deliberate choice by the author to do that because he's telling a story of the difference in the responsibilities of males and females in the stories. Kids love that. I've done that activity with a primary 2 class and had them, you know, up in arms about why this was so. So it's not something that can't be done with even young children. 4th step, of course, is making controlled writing. And this is, I suppose they use the term controlled here because it's not just about right, off you go. You know, start from scratch. You need to do, I would be doing some modelling of my own, then I would be doing some shared writing, innovating on texts that are already there. For example, if you were doing nouns and noun groups, you could take away all the lovely adjectives in a story and then replace them, have the children make sure they add to them, until they've built up enough knowledge of the grammatical elements of the particular type of text, in this case narratives, to be able to do that. It's really important that they have the experience and the secret knowledge that's inside those texts in order to be able to do it. Okay. With assessment, because I know this is something important that comes along with any type of teaching, grammatical knowledge is something that, you know, looking at a standardized test is not going to tell you what they can do in their writing. It's only going to tell you whether they can identify the terminology. As I said before, we know from research that doing exercises does not feed over into writing. So some things that I would be doing, some formative assessment along the way, when we're doing the reading and investigation, you know, the children are in pairs or small groups and they're collecting all of the verbs from the story, have a quick checklist, you could write some anecdotal notes. When you get to the explicit teaching stage, you might take some work from the children. You might take away the work that they've done around that and you might do some analysis of it. You might have checklists or anecdotal notes again when you're doing the discussion or experimentation. But of course, the summative assessment that comes from the controlled writing is when you will really see whether they've been able to could be something like use a range of different types of verbs to tell a story. Use a range of verbs to describe an event in detail, some of these. And of course, then you can look for what types of verbs that they have used. So I wonder how this compares to what you have experienced either yourself as a student or what you do in your classroom. Do you see that you can make some links to your practice already? Does it give you something new to do? Have you been doing something like this and maybe not thought about it in a particular framework? But this is definitely something, whether it's the teaching over a few days or the teaching over a few weeks, that can give you opportunities for scaffolding something that is quite challenging for many children. Okay, so a lot of times teachers ask me what they should buy. I don't know of any really great books to be used in the classroom for teaching grammar, but I do know 2 books that are good for you. In particular, the green one. This is an Australian text, but I believe that you can still access it here. It's called A New Grammar Companion. It is absolutely brilliant. Beverly Derawianka is the author. In that, she describes so clearly and so concisely all of the grammatical concepts that we teach, that we should know about. And most beautifully, it just makes sense the way that she's organised that. For an option that I know is available here in the UK, it's this one, Essential Primary Grammar. When you see the name Deborah Myhill, you should jump on it. She's the expert in the UK about the teaching of grammar and has some fantastic ideas. That one, I have both of them myself, of course, but if you really need to build your own knowledge, I would go with the green one. The purple one gives you a little bit more pedagogical information, but if you can buy both, I would. I don't have any financial investment in either of those 2, by the way. They're just, both I know are fantastic. Okay, so the last thing to say is that in session 2, next Monday, I'm going to talk through the 4 steps again, but this time talking about sentence level grammar and examples of how you might teach the 4 different types of sentences: simple, compound, simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. And again, linking that to a particular type of text that we might need to be teaching our children how to write. So I'm going to leave it there and just open it up to any kinds of conversations or questions that you might have, concerns, whether you can reiterate that this is exactly what you've been doing in class. That would be great to hear as well. Okay. And I wasn't looking, I should have told you I wasn't looking at the chat, so I'm sorry. Anyone like to make a comment? Okay, some people agreeing there with some of the comments. That's great. Does anyone, did you know beforehand about 4 types of verbs?
I have heard it somewhere, Kylie, but it just kind of reiterated it. But I like the fact that you were able to link into the importance for writing for children and how it can enhance their writing, that awareness. Yeah.
And the most exciting day will come, and I can still remember this happening to me, I've just got goosebumps, is, having a primary 6 child come up to me and say, I've added in some thinking verbs so you know what my character's thinking. You're like, this is just beautiful. This is, there's no other purpose for it. Apart from also reading critically. Reading critically and seeing that stuff on the news, and how, how we describe something is incredibly important. So again, I'll perhaps look at increasing a little bit of that discussion next week as well. Verbs, learning about verbs, terrific. When I learnt it, and of course it was after I'd been to school, after I'd been teaching a number of years, And I just felt, why had I not learnt this stuff when I was at school? Anyone else?
Hi Kelly, it's Yvonne McBlain here from... Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Yvonne McBlain here from Falkirk Children's Services. I just really wanted to echo what I think it was Elaine was saying as well. Yes, all of the things you were saying about the historical teaching of drama resonated greatly with me.
Yes.
And although I've not been able to get the presentation downloaded, I've taken notes and I'm looking forward to kind of analysing that for myself. So yeah, like
Excellent.
others, I've learned a lot about verbs tonight.
Excellent.
And I love the idea of the sort of meta level, the children knowing and understanding and being able to construct their sentences from a word level, as you said. So thank you.
Thank you. If you have any trouble, I'm on Twitter, so you could send me a message. Just make sure you do get it though. So yeah, the meta language is something, you know, when I say to my students, my pre-service teachers, would you go to take your car into a mechanic and have, you know, say to him or her, the car's not working right, there's some kind of noise in the engine. And they said to you, oh, well, the thingamajigget might be rubbing on the roundy bit thing there and I'll just have a look. You wouldn't do that, because you cannot understand how something works without being able to describe and understand each component, each piece. And that's what the English language is for us as speakers and users of it. So we should embrace all of that beautiful meta language and be then as powerful as, you know, people writing on the internet, people writing in the news, to be able to analyze what they're doing and what they're trying to do to us as readers. Okay, I'll put the link in again here. It should just take you to Google Docs and you should be able to download it straight away. Actually, let me see if I can add it here. I'll make sure. Okay, I'll do that in a second. I'll make sure that it's there ready for you, but hopefully that will get there. So yeah, I'm doing some reading around functional grammar online. Read, do some lovely YouTube clips about verbs. Next week, when we talk about sentence level, I'll take you through noun groups. I'm not sure if you know that, there's a whole lot of patterning that goes into noun groups and how we put one thing in front of the other or not. And that can be really powerful as well. So join me next Monday if you'd like to. And if you have any trouble getting the handout.
Kylie,
yes.
Kylie, you know how you mentioned the cat and fish text has been very good, having a really good example of having lots of really good, a variety of verbs. Do you have any other text that you would recommend? Just off the top of your head.
Anything by Anthony Brown. He usually has stuff just oozing. The other one I've been thinking of at the moment is it's for actually adjectives. This one.
All right, okay.
I've been looking at this one. I just bought myself a copy. I would probably spend about 6 years working with this book because it's got so much potential. One of the things that I think I would do if I was using this is to look at not only the adjectives, plump. Each page, I think bar one has an adjective, but it's an unfinished kind of story. So I would be using this in the controlled writing at the end. So I'd put all of these 3, this, 4, this, 5, this, and I would have to turn it into a narrative with this beautiful descriptive work.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is pictures, okay? So verbs, any type of pictures. In fact, there's a great website that's just got a whole load of pictures you can look at. So what do we do here? We describe what's happening. Pecking, leaning, balancing. So all of these beautiful pictures can be used for conversations.
I must admit, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of just starting with the picture.
Yeah. So with older kids, I've done things like, you know, downloaded a picture of the cast of a television show, and we've used descriptive terminology to describe them, you know, Big Bang Theory, and you know, who's this person, and, you know, they can then use their background. The other thing I'll talk about next week, but I'll give it to you now, is freeze frames. So when if you've got a story, get them into a freeze frame and then ask them what their character might be thinking, saying, doing, and you can have lots of conversations around all of those, the 9 parts of speech then as well.
What was the website you mentioned? You said there was a website that had lots of pictures.
Yes, I'll share it on Twitter because it's not on the top of my head, but I'll do that in a minute.
That's so helpful. Thank you, Kylie.
Okay. All right, I won't keep you any longer, but hopefully I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about sentences then.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.